The next question is from Ananda Chakravorty.
In 1985, Sting asked the world if the Russians love their children too. Almost 30 years later and beyond the abyss of the Cold War, there has been a tangible improvement in relations between Russia and the rest of the world. But does Putin's re-election signal a return or indeed an intensification of that same oppression?
Masha.
Well, I think that, Sting was actually a little bit confused when he sent out that message. That idea that if the Russians love their children too, then it's a country just like any other country, really confuses the issue. Because, in fact, the difference between a democratic country and a dictatorship is that in a dictatorship, the government does not represent the people. And the fact that the Russians love their children too is a little bit irrelevant, not to the people, but to the state. Right?
I guess what he was trying to say is to Americans who've seen Russians and the Soviet Union per se as being inhabited by monsters, that there's a kind of truth that everyone is human.
Right, but I think it would have been more useful to say, listen, it's not inhabited by monsters. It is a monster.
Yeah, okay.
Right? And Russia is a monster right now. It is not inhabited by monsters.
And you think the man who's running the country is a monster?
Absolutely, I do.
Tell us why.
Because he's a ruthless dictator who has had a lot of his opponents killed, because he has destroyed the Russian electoral system, he has monopolized the Russian media, and right now, as we speak, I am pretty sure, as just a couple of hours ago, people are being arrested in the streets of Moscow just for being out in the streets of Moscow, right? Attention, not for protesting, not for demonstrating, but for being out in the streets of Moscow because they're suspected of possibly being potential protesters, right? That's what's happening right now. And this country is run by a man whom the Western world still refuses to call a monster.
Tell us a little bit about where he came from, because he was a fairly low-level spy at Dresden in Germany at the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall, and yet he rose very quickly through the ranks. And he also amassed a great fortune along the way, like so many KGB officers immediately after the fall of communism. Just tell us how that happened.
Certainly did. He went back to the Soviet Union after the Berlin Wall fell, and he no longer had a job in Germany. He very quickly got a job in the St. Petersburg city government. He became deputy mayor. While he was in that job, he embezzled somewhere, and this is just the documented part, somewhere between $10 and $100 million. There was an investigation that showed that he did this. This is, by the standards of the early 1990s in Russia, it's just an unbelievable amount of money. The city council recommended to the mayor that he dismiss him and have him prosecuted. The mayor dismissed the city council instead and proceeded to rule by decree. Then eventually the mayor lost the election. Putin moved to Moscow, had a management job in the Kremlin for a while. And then in 1999, Boris Yeltsin, who had been president of Russia for 10 years, who had once been an incredibly popular and charismatic politician, had really lost his touch. He had really become very unpopular. He had alienated all of his allies. And he was afraid that he was going to be prosecuted if the opposition came into office after he finished his second term, and he was close to the end of it. He was also ill. He was drinking a lot. The people who remained close to him, and this is very few people, started looking for somebody who would be loyal, who could be installed as his successor. And they didn't have a lot of people to choose from, and that's like the absurd part of the story. And as I researched it, I was just amazed by this. Here we have the world's largest landmass with all these nuclear warheads. And we have a dozen people, a dozen at most, looking through the files of a half dozen people who all seem fairly indistinguishable from one another, none of whom really have a public record. And they're trying to choose who is going to run this country. And so they chose Putin. The fact that they chose Putin and not another faceless bureaucrat was really an accident. But it's a very unfortunate accident.
Are there any parallels in history? I mean, in Soviet history or in European history? And I'm just wondering if you, particularly since you consider him to be a dictator and a pretty much unstoppable one, I mean, do you see parallels with Germany in the 1930s?
Sure. I mean, first of all, ordinary men do become dictators, and that's something that we don't always remember. But it's actually a common narrative. Stalin was a very ordinary man. He was regarded by his party comrades as somebody who wasn't really leadership potential. So many of the men around him were extraordinary, and he wasn't. Hitler, by some accounts, was also a pretty unremarkable little guy. A
pretty extraordinary public speaker,
but
which Putin is not.
Which Putin is not, although he had an interesting oratorial device that worked for him for a while. He still uses it. It's sort of below the belt humor. It's, you know, when he says he's going to wipe out the terrorists in the outhouse, or when he promises to have a French journalist circumcised in such a way that nothing will ever grow there again. I'm quoting.
Let me bring in Greg Sheridan, foreign editor. Why don't we talk about this, you know, on a regular basis? I mean, Russia just goes under the radar in Australia.
Well, I think you're right, Tony. Masha knows 800 million times more about Russia than I do, but I have the advantage of her in one sense. I met Putin when he came to Australia for APEC, and he held... one
of those rare times he had his shirt on.
Yeah, and I must say, he was incredibly funny and charismatic. He told a story about how the deposed Democratic leader Kerensky, after the Bolshevik Revolution, came to live in Brisbane. And this was bizarre, not because he chose Brisbane, but he lived with a journalist, and that showed what a fool he was, and so on. It was all very funny. But I think he gets away with a lot in the West because he has a good patter. But I agree with Masha profoundly that just as the future evolution of China is the greatest question in the world today, this tragic missed opportunity for democracy in Russia is one of the most tragic developments of the last 50 years. Now, hopefully it will be redeemed. Russia remains profoundly important to Western civilization. It possesses thousands of nuclear weapons. It possesses a huge share of the world's natural resources. And you have to feel that the Western leadership contributed to the missed opportunity for Russian democracy at the fall of the Soviet Union. We didn't give very good advice, we didn't pay enough attention, and I'm not saying that we were responsible, but I think this was a contributing factor in the failure of Russian democracy.
Do you have any thoughts on this, Jeffrey? I mean, in the United States, well, foreign policy is not very widely discussed anyway, but Russia's certainly not.
Well, I think it's another casualty of 9/11 in a sense, because you know, America especially got so distracted by that Putin for a while was just left to, you know, do what he wanted, and Bush famously thought that he saw into his soul at the same time, but that was very, you know, an easy thing to do because he didn't want to deal with that problem. That was one problem too many. So,
Glenn?
I think we experienced the same sort of death by a thousand cuts, or changes imperceptibly, very, very slowly, with what the West thought about Putin and what happened in Russia. As the West lived with Germany in the 1930s, there are a series of small steps that each time one could rationalize and say, well, you know, we really can't take dramatic steps because that's just sort of one thing, and we'll try to work it out. And then progressively, the slide came to an ordinary man becoming a dictator. I think that's what we've had.
All right, we're almost out.